June 12, 1942. The dense jungle of Guadalcanal Island sat silent under the mid-morning sun as humidity pressed down like a hot, wet blanket. Beneath the canopy of towering coconut palms and banyan trees, a Japanese reconnaissance patrol moved with practiced discipline, confident that their superior military training would allow them to navigate this primitive island without detection. Lieutenant Takeo Yamashita believed his 12-man patrol would complete their mapping mission and return to base camp by nightfall, having encountered nothing more dangerous than the occasional wild pig or venomous spider. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the extraordinary account of how one American scout with unconventional skills would fundamentally transform the nature of jungle warfare in the Pacific, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't found in arsenals, but in knowledge passed down through generations. In the early months of 1942, the strategic island of Guadalcanal had become a focal point of the Pacific campaign. The Japanese had established a crucial airfield on the northern coast, which, if completed, would threaten Allied supply routes to Australia and New Zealand. The United States military recognized that taking control of this airfield would be essential to halting Japanese expansion in the South Pacific. What neither side fully appreciated was how the jungle itself would become both battlefield and weapon. 200 miles to the east, on a transport ship bound for Guadalcanal, Sergeant James Solomon sat quietly on deck, sharpening his K-bar knife with practiced precision. At 32 years of age, Solomon was older than most of the Marines around him. His dark skin glistened with sweat in the tropical heat as he methodically ran the whetstone along the blade. The other men in his unit had initially kept their distance. The Marine Corps of 1942 remained largely segregated, with most black servicemen assigned to support roles rather than combat positions. "That knife could split hairs, Sarge," remarked Corporal Michael O'Malley, a freckled Bostonian who had gradually warmed to the quiet, competent Solomon. "My grandfather always said a dull blade is more dangerous than a sharp one," Solomon replied without looking up. "Makes you work harder, increases the chance of a slip." His voice carried the soft cadence of rural Louisiana, where he had grown up hunting in the bayous and swamps outside Baton Rouge. Captain Thomas Ellsworth approached, his uniform already stained with sweat patches despite the early hour. At 28, Ellsworth had been hastily promoted as the Marine Corps expanded to meet wartime demands. A former history teacher from Virginia, he had quickly recognized Solomon's potential value when reviewing personnel files. "Sergeant Solomon, we're having a briefing in 15 minutes. Intelligence has some new information about Japanese patrol patterns on the island." Solomon nodded, testing his blade on a loose thread from his uniform, which parted instantly. "I'll be there, sir." The ship's mess hall had been converted into a makeshift briefing room. Maps of Guadalcanal were pinned to the bulkheads, showing the island's irregular coastline and the dark green mass of jungle that covered most of its interior. Lieutenant Colonel James Matthews, the intelligence officer, pointed to the northern area where Henderson Field was under construction by the Japanese. "Gentlemen, our primary objective remains securing the airfield," Matthews began, "but we have a secondary problem. Japanese reconnaissance teams are moving throughout these jungle sectors, mapping trails and establishing observation posts. We need to eliminate these patrols before they complete their survey work." Captain Ellsworth raised his hand. "What's their patrol strength typically look like?" "Usually 12 to 15 men," Matthews replied. "Well-armed, well-trained. The problem is finding them. We've sent out 3 reconnaissance teams of our own in the past week. Only 1 returned." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. "Sir," Solomon spoke up, surprising those around him. He rarely contributed during briefings. "Permission to speak freely." Colonel Matthews nodded. "You're approaching this from a conventional military perspective. The jungle doesn't work that way. Those Japanese patrols are leaving signs everywhere. They just know our boys can't read them." Several officers exchanged skeptical glances. Matthews' expression hardened slightly. "And I suppose you can, Sergeant?" "Yes, sir, I can. I grew up tracking deer, boar, and alligator through the Louisiana swamps. My grandfather was half Choctaw. He taught me how to read the land, how to move through it without leaving traces." Captain Ellsworth interjected. "Colonel, that's why I requested Sergeant Solomon's transfer to our unit. His file mentions extensive hunting and tracking experience." Matthews looked unconvinced but pragmatic enough to consider any potential advantage. "What exactly are you suggesting, Sergeant?" "Let me take a small team, no more than 4 men. We'll move faster, quieter. I can track these Japanese patrols, and we can either eliminate them or report their positions for larger forces to engage." The colonel considered this for a moment. "Captain Ellsworth, you vouch for this man?" "I do, sir. His marksmanship scores are top of the unit, and his fieldcraft skills during training exercises were exceptional." Matthews sighed. "Very well. Sergeant Solomon, select 3 men. You'll deploy 24 hours ahead of the main landing force. Consider this a test run. If successful, we may expand the approach." As the briefing concluded, Solomon found himself surrounded by volunteers. The initial racial barriers that had kept men at a distance seemed less important now that they were facing combat together. He selected Corporal O'Malley, whose quick thinking he had come to respect. Private First Class David Rodriguez, who had grown up hunting in the mountains of New Mexico, and Private Thomas Jenkins, a former lumberjack from Oregon, whose physical strength would be valuable for the endurance required. That evening, as the men prepared their gear, Captain Ellsworth visited Solomon's quarters. "Are you certain about this, Sergeant? Intelligence estimates there are at least 8 active Japanese patrols in our landing zone." Solomon continued methodically checking his equipment. "With respect, sir, those intelligence estimates are based on conventional thinking. I'm counting on that." "What do you mean?" "The Japanese are disciplined, methodical. They've studied European and American military tactics. But they haven't studied how to move silently through dense vegetation like my grandfather taught me. They haven't learned to track prey that's actively trying not to be found." Ellsworth nodded slowly. "I hope you're right. The success of the initial landing may depend on it." "There's something else, sir," Solomon added, his voice dropping slightly. "The men you've assigned me, they're good soldiers, but they're going to need to follow my lead without question. Some of them might not be used to taking orders from someone who looks like me." Ellsworth met Solomon's gaze directly. "I've made it clear to them. In the jungle, you're in command. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me after the mission, if they survive without you." The next morning, under the cover of pre-dawn darkness, Solomon and his 3-man team were transported by rubber boat from the ship to a small cove on the eastern side of Guadalcanal, 5 miles from the planned landing zone for the main force. Each man carried minimal equipment, their weapons, 3 days of rations, canteens, first aid supplies, and communication equipment. Solomon had insisted they leave behind anything that might create unnecessary noise. As they pulled the rubber boat into the concealment of overhanging vegetation, Solomon knelt at the jungle's edge, examining the ground carefully. "What are you looking for, Sarge?" Jenkins whispered. "Signs," Solomon replied softly, running his fingers over a section of soil. "The jungle's alive. Everything that moves through it leaves a mark. Most folks just never learned how to see them. The first mile inland was the most dangerous. They had no intelligence on whether Japanese patrols monitored this coastline. Solomon led them in single file, moving at what seemed to the others an agonizingly slow pace. Every few hundred yards he would stop, listen, and study the environment. Sometimes he would point silently to marks on the ground or broken vegetation that meant nothing to the others. 3 hours after landing, he suddenly raised his fist, the signal to halt. Dropping to one knee, he gestured for the others to gather close. "Japanese patrol passed through here, heading northwest," he whispered. 12 men moving fast, probably headed toward the airfield. O'Malley looked at the ground dubiously. "How could you possibly know that, Sarge?" Solomon pointed to what appeared to be undisturbed ground. "See how the leaves are positioned. They've been deliberately arranged to look natural after being stepped on. It's good work, but not perfect. And here," he indicated a barely visible depression, "that's from a rifle butt being rested. The depth tells me the man was standing still for at least a minute." "And you can count 12 men from this?" Rodriguez asked skeptically. "No," Solomon replied patiently. "I counted their boot prints in that soft patch of soil we passed 30 yards back. Japanese standard-issue combat boots have a distinctive tread pattern. 12 sets, all moving in the same direction, all fresh, within the last 4 hours. The men exchanged impressed glances as Solomon continued. We're going to follow them, but at a distance. I want to observe their patterns, how they move, how often they rest. Then we'll radio their position to command. For the next 6 hours, Solomon tracked the Japanese patrol through the dense jungle with a precision that amazed his teammates. He identified signs invisible to untrained eyes, a broken spiderweb indicating someone had passed recently, subtle depressions in moss-covered logs, occasionally a partial boot print in soft earth. He taught as they moved, pointing out indicators, helping the others begin to see the jungle through his experienced eyes. By mid-afternoon, Solomon raised his hand for them to stop. Ahead, through the dense foliage, they could make out the sounds of men setting up camp. The Japanese patrol had stopped to rest during the hottest part of the day. "Perfect," Solomon whispered. "They're establishing a pattern. Now we watch." From concealed positions, they observed the Japanese soldiers. Lieutenant Yamashita maintained strict discipline. Men spoke in hushed tones. Sentries were posted in pairs. Equipment was meticulously maintained. They were clearly veteran troops, not raw recruits. "They're good," O'Malley whispered. "Professional." Solomon nodded. "Yes, but they're still making mistakes." He pointed to various aspects of the Japanese camp. How they had positioned their sentries with overlapping fields of vision, but had neglected to consider approach from above. How they had cleared ground to make sleeping areas more comfortable, but in doing so had created unnatural patterns in the vegetation. "They're thinking like soldiers, not hunters," Solomon explained. "In the jungle, that's a critical difference." After an hour, the Japanese patrol resumed their march. Solomon's team followed at a safe distance, maintaining communication silence except for brief coded radio transmissions to update command on the patrol's location and heading. As dusk approached, Solomon led his team to a small elevated area that offered good visibility and multiple escape routes. "We'll rest here tonight." 2-hour watch rotations. No fires, cold rations only. While the others prepared their sleeping positions, Solomon took the first watch. The jungle transformed as darkness fell. New sounds emerged. Different predators became active. Solomon felt at home in this environment in ways the others couldn't understand. The constant humidity, the symphony of insects, the subtle movements of nocturnal creatures. It reminded him of countless nights spent in Louisiana's Atchafalaya Basin with his grandfather. His thoughts drifted to those formative years, when an elderly Choctaw-descended man had patiently taught a young boy not just how to hunt, but how to become part of the environment he moved through. "The animals don't fear what they don't notice," his grandfather would say. "And what they do notice, they fear for good reason." Solomon's reflections were interrupted by a faint, unnatural sound, metal on metal, barely audible above the jungle noise, but distinctive to his trained ear. He silently woke O'Malley, who was scheduled for the next watch. "Movement northwest, approximately 200 yards, he whispered. "Wake the others, but keep absolutely silent." Within moments, all 4 Marines were alert, weapons ready. Solomon signaled for them to remain in position while he investigated. Moving like a ghost through the underbrush, he disappeared into the darkness. 20 tense minutes passed before he returned. "Another patrol," he informed them quietly. 8 men, moving east. Different unit from the one we've been tracking. They've set up camp for the night about 150 yards from here." "That's awfully close," Jenkins whispered nervously. Solomon nodded. "They have no idea we're here. Their sentries are alert, but they're watching for conventional approaches. We're going to stay right here, maintain absolute silence. They'll move out at dawn." The night passed without incident. As Solomon had predicted, the Japanese patrol broke camp at first light and continued eastward. Once they were safely distant, Solomon gathered his team. "We now know there are at least 2 active Japanese patrols in this sector. Based on their movements, they're conducting a systematic survey of the area, probably mapping trails and terrain features for the defense of Henderson Field." "What's our play, Sarge?" Rodriguez asked. "Follow one of them?" Solomon studied their map briefly. No. We're going to continue tracking the original patrol. Their route suggests they're heading toward what might be a forward command post or supply cache. That would be valuable intelligence. They resumed their pursuit of the first patrol, making good time through the increasingly familiar terrain. Solomon's team was learning quickly, beginning to move more quietly, to spot signs of passage that would have been invisible to them days before. By midday, Solomon detected a change in the patrol's movement pattern. They're more cautious now, he observed, studying disturbed vegetation. Moving slower, taking more time to conceal their trail. They're getting close to something important. An hour later, they had their answer. The Japanese patrol had arrived at a small clearing where a supply depot had been established. Crates of ammunition, rations, and medical supplies were stacked under camouflage netting. 6 additional Japanese soldiers staffed this outpost, bringing the total enemy presence to 18. From a concealed position, Solomon observed the operation through binoculars, while Rodriguez used their radio to relay coordinates back to command. The response came quickly. Maintain observation, report any changes, avoid engagement unless absolutely necessary. The main landing force would hit the beaches the following morning. Looks like we just sit tight, O'Malley whispered. Solomon shook his head slightly. No, this changes things. This supply depot is only 8 miles from the planned landing zone. If the Japanese can dispatch reinforcements from here, they could hit our boys coming off the beaches. But orders are to observe only, Jenkins reminded him. Solomon considered this dilemma carefully. His military training told him to follow orders explicitly, but his hunter's instinct and his responsibility to the Marines who would soon be landing suggested a different course. We're going to compromise, he finally decided. We'll continue observation through the night. If they show no sign of moving toward the landing zones by dawn, we'll maintain our position as ordered. If they begin mobilizing toward our landing areas, we'll have to act. The afternoon passed tensely as they watched the Japanese soldiers inventory supplies and study maps. Lieutenant Yamashita appeared to be an efficient, respected leader, maintaining discipline while treating his men firmly but fairly. Solomon found himself respecting the Japanese officer's professionalism, even as he planned for the possibility of having to eliminate his entire command. As darkness fell, the Japanese established a more permanent camp than their previous overnight position. Sentries were posted in a comprehensive perimeter, and shifts were organized for the night. Solomon recognized that any approach would be significantly more challenging than at their previous encounters. They've set up properly this time, he whispered to his team. Multiple overlapping fields of fire, elevated observation points. These aren't just reconnaissance troops, they've had combat experience. So what's the plan if they move toward our landing zone? O'Malley asked. Solomon's expression was grim. We create a diversion to draw them in the opposite direction, then eliminate as many as we can to disrupt their ability to threaten the landing. 4 of us against 18 of them? Jenkins looked skeptical. The jungle is the equalizer, Solomon replied. We're not going to fight them on their terms, we'll fight them on nature's terms. Throughout the night, Solomon's team took turns observing the Japanese camp. Nothing in their activity suggested immediate movement toward the landing zones, but Solomon remained vigilant. His grandfather had taught him that prediction was as important as observation, understanding not just what your prey was doing, but what it would do next. At approximately 0200 hours, Solomon noticed increased activity in the camp. Radio operators became busier, and Lieutenant Yamashita gathered his non-commissioned officers for a brief meeting. Solomon couldn't hear their conversation, but the body language told him something significant had changed. "Wake everyone," he whispered to Rodriguez, who had been sharing the watch. "Something's happening." Within minutes, the Japanese soldiers began preparing for movement. Equipment was packed efficiently, and the supply depot was being secured for what appeared to be a temporary absence rather than abandonment. "They've received new orders," Solomon observed. "Question is, where are they going?" As the Japanese patrol formed up, Solomon studied their preparation carefully. The direction they faced, the equipment they prioritized, the specific men Lieutenant Yamashita positioned at point, all provided clues. "They're heading southwest," he concluded grimly. "Directly toward our landing zones. They must have received intelligence about the invasion." O'Malley checked his watch. The landing is scheduled for 0700. That's 5 hours from now. This patrol could be in position before our first wave hits the beach. Solomon made his decision. Rodriguez, radio command. Inform them Japanese forces are mobilizing toward the landing zone from our position. We are engaging to delay and disrupt. As Rodriguez made the transmission, Solomon gathered O'Malley and Jenkins closer. Here's how we're going to do this. We're not going to engage them directly as a unit. That would be suicide. Instead, we'll use the techniques my grandfather taught me for hunting dangerous prey like wild boar or alligator. He quickly outlined his strategy. They would separate, using predetermined routes to flank, and then get ahead of the Japanese patrol. Rather than confronting all 18 soldiers at once, they would create a series of incidents that would force the Japanese to slow down, change direction, and ultimately become disoriented in the unfamiliar jungle. The key is to make them think they're facing a much larger force, Solomon explained. We hit them from different directions, never from the same position twice. We use the jungle itself as a weapon. The plan was daring and unconventional, exactly the opposite of established Marine Corps tactics, which emphasized coordinated firepower and direct engagement. But Solomon knew conventional tactics would get them killed against superior numbers. As the Japanese patrol moved out from their supply depot, Solomon and his team took their positions. The hunters were about to become the hunted, though the Japanese had no way of knowing it yet. Lieutenant Yamashita led his men along a narrow jungle trail, moving with as much speed as caution would allow. He had received orders to intercept a suspected American landing force approaching the western beaches. His patrol, combined with the supply depot personnel, represented the closest Japanese combat unit to the reported landing site. The first hour of their march proceeded without incident. The jungle was alive with its usual nocturnal sounds, providing excellent audio cover for their movement. Yamashita maintained standard patrol formation, point man 20 meters ahead, flankers 10 meters to each side, the main body in a staggered column with rear security. Corporal Tanaka, one of Yamashita's most experienced soldiers, served as point man. He moved confidently through the darkness, his eyes well adjusted after hours in the jungle. The first sign that something was wrong came when he noticed an unusual pattern in the undergrowth ahead, a subtle disturbance that didn't match animal movement or natural causes. He raised his hand to signal a halt, then moved forward cautiously to investigate. As he knelt to examine the ground, a sound to his right drew his attention. He turned just in time to see a shadow detach from a tree trunk and move with incredible speed. Before he could shout a warning, he felt a powerful blow to the side of his head. Sergeant Solomon caught the Japanese soldier before he could fall and make noise, lowering him silently to the ground. One enemy neutralized without alerting the others. He quickly retreated into the jungle, circling to his next position. When Corporal Tanaka failed to return or signal, Lieutenant Yamashita dispatched 2 soldiers to investigate. They found Tanaka unconscious but alive, a development more concerning than if he had been eliminated. Someone had deliberately left him alive, which suggested confidence, not desperation. Yamashita immediately ordered his men into defensive formation. "We are not alone," he informed them quietly. "Maintain absolute vigilance." The patrol continued their movement with heightened caution, which significantly reduced their pace, exactly as Solomon had intended. The next phase of his plan was already in motion. Private Jenkins, following Solomon's instructions, had moved ahead of the patrol and climbed a massive banyan tree overlooking the most likely route. As the Japanese patrol came into view below him, he waited for the precise moment Solomon had specified, when the point element had passed, but before the main body arrived. With carefully controlled strength, Jenkins broke several large branches, creating a loud crashing sound to the patrol's left flank. Immediately, several Japanese soldiers turned and fired in that direction. Jenkins remained perfectly still as bullets thumped into the foliage around him. Lieutenant Yamashita ordered ceasefire and sent 4 men to investigate the disturbance. This split his force, reducing its effectiveness, again, as Solomon had planned. The 4-man Japanese team found nothing at the source of the noise, which unsettled them more than finding an enemy would have. As they regrouped with the main patrol, Yamashita noted their unease. "Maintain discipline," he ordered sharply. "This is either American scouts or local natives. Either way, they are trying to slow us down." He was partially correct, but underestimated both the sophistication of the strategy being employed against him and the skill of the man directing it. From his new position, Solomon watched the Japanese patrol resume their march. They had already lost nearly 30 minutes responding to the first two incidents. The landing was still 4 hours away. He needed to continue disrupting and delaying without revealing the true size of his team. O'Malley was in position for the third phase, using techniques Solomon had taught him over the past 2 days to mimic animal sounds that would seem normal to untrained ears, but would signal danger to experienced jungle fighters like the Japanese veterans. The series of bird calls O'Malley produced were slightly out of sequence and season, a subtle wrongness that the Japanese soldiers instantly recognized. They halted again, scanning the canopy and surrounding vegetation. While their attention was directed upward, Rodriguez executed his part of the plan, creating a distinct rustling movement through underbrush nearly 50 yards behind the patrol. The psychological effect was immediate and powerful. The Japanese soldiers now believed they were being tracked by a sizable enemy force moving on both flanks and to their rear. Lieutenant Yamashita, a pragmatic commander, ordered his men into a defensive circle to assess the situation. "They are attempting to delay us," he told his subordinates. "We must reach the landing zone before the American main force. We cannot allow these harassment tactics to prevent us from completing our mission." Yamashita decided to change their route, believing they had stumbled into an American patrol's territory. He led his men on a more southerly heading, hoping to bypass the perceived threat. Solomon had anticipated this reaction. The new route would take the Japanese patrol into even more difficult terrain, a section of jungle with dense undergrowth and treacherous footing. The delay would compound significantly. As dawn approached, the Japanese patrol had covered less than half the distance to the landing zone. Lieutenant Yamashita realized they would not arrive in time to establish defensive positions before the American landing. He radioed his superiors, recommending additional forces be diverted to the area. This transmission was exactly what Solomon had been waiting for. Using the compact direction-finding equipment they carried, Rodriguez pinpointed the Japanese radio operator's position. Solomon now knew precisely where the command element of the patrol was located. "Time for the final phase," he whispered to his team. "They've called for reinforcements. We need to eliminate their leadership and communications now." The sky was beginning to lighten, the jungle transitioning from black to deep blues and greens. Solomon led his team in a converging movement toward the Japanese command position. They had successfully fragmented the Japanese patrol through their harassment tactics. Several small groups were now spread across a wide area, attempting to secure their perimeter against the phantom force they believed was stalking them. Lieutenant Yamashita, his radioman, and 3 soldiers remained at the center of this dispersed formation. They had established a small command post in a depression that offered good cover from horizontal fire, but, critically, was vulnerable from above. Solomon directed O'Malley and Jenkins to create diversions on opposite sides of the Japanese perimeter. Rodriguez would target the radioman, while Solomon himself would neutralize Lieutenant Yamashita. The simultaneous diversions drew immediate response from the Japanese security elements. Taking advantage of the momentary chaos, Solomon moved with astonishing speed and silence directly toward Yamashita. The Japanese officer sensed movement too late, turning just as Solomon closed the final distance between them. What followed demonstrated why Solomon's grandfather had considered him a natural hunter. His movements were precise, economical, and devastatingly effective. Lieutenant Yamashita had no opportunity to raise an alarm before being neutralized. Simultaneously, Rodriguez eliminated the radioman, cutting off the patrol's communication capability. With their command structure disabled, the remaining Japanese soldiers found themselves isolated in small groups in unfamiliar terrain, unsure of the enemy's strength or position. By the time the sun rose fully above the horizon, Solomon's team had systematically neutralized or scattered the entire 18-man Japanese force. The path to the landing zone was clear, and Marine Corps landing craft were approaching the beaches uncontested. When Captain Ellsworth came ashore with the third wave at 0745, he found Sergeant Solomon and his team waiting at the designated rendezvous point. "Mission accomplished, sir," Solomon reported. "Japanese patrol neutralized, supply depot located and coordinates transmitted to command." Ellsworth looked at the four men with newfound respect. They showed signs of their ordeal: exhaustion, jungle scratches, soaked uniforms, but they stood with quiet confidence. "How the hell did you do it?" Ellsworth asked. "Intelligence estimated at least 18 enemy combatants at that position." Solomon's reply was characteristically understated. "We didn't fight them, sir. We hunted them." As additional Marine units secured the beachhead and began moving inland, word of Solomon's team's achievement spread quickly. Colonel Matthews personally debriefed them, pressing for details of their unconventional tactics. "I need to understand exactly how four men managed to neutralize a force more than 4 times their size," Matthews insisted. Solomon explained the fundamentals of what his grandfather had taught him: how to read the jungle, how to move through it invisibly, how to use the psychology of fear and uncertainty against a numerically superior force. He emphasized that these weren't techniques that could be quickly taught in standard military training. They represented generations of knowledge passed down through his family and tribe. "With respect, sir, most of your men are trying to fight against the jungle," Solomon concluded. "We succeeded because we let the jungle fight with us." Matthews considered this thoughtfully. "Sergeant, I'm authorizing you to form a specialized reconnaissance and counter-patrol unit, effective immediately. Captain Ellsworth will provide administrative support, but you'll have operational autonomy. Select anyone you need, any men who you believe can learn what you know." By nightfall, as Marine forces consolidated their positions around what would soon be renamed Henderson Field, Solomon sat with his original team. Additional volunteers had already approached them, eager to join what was being called Solomon's Hunters by the other Marines. "You know what this means," O'Malley said quietly. "Everything changes now." Solomon nodded, his expression serious. "War in the Pacific won't be won by who has the most men or the most firepower. It'll be won by who can adapt fastest to fighting in this environment." He gestured to the dark jungle surrounding their position. "Out there, conventional military thinking can get you killed. We need to teach our boys to become part of the jungle, not fight against it." As he spoke, Solomon knew that the journey ahead would be challenging. Traditional military leadership would resist his unconventional methods. Racial barriers would create additional obstacles. But the success of their mission had opened a door that couldn't easily be closed again. The Americans had established their foothold on Guadalcanal. The battle for the island, and indeed the entire Pacific, was just beginning. But Solomon had demonstrated that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a new technology or overwhelming force, but ancient knowledge applied with precision and respect for the environment. In the darkness, Solomon listened to the sounds of the jungle, so similar to his Louisiana home, yet different in subtle ways he was already learning to distinguish. His grandfather would have been proud. The old man had always told him, "The land teaches those willing to listen." Now Solomon would teach others to listen, and in doing so might change the course of the war in the Pacific. August 3rd, 1942. A steady rain fell over Guadalcanal, turning the jungle floor into a treacherous landscape of mud and swollen streams. 3 weeks had passed since the Marines had established their beachhead, and the battle for control of the strategic island had intensified. The Japanese forces had recovered from their initial surprise and were now mounting increasingly coordinated counterattacks to reclaim Henderson Field. In a small clearing 2 miles from the American perimeter, Sergeant James Solomon knelt beside a barely perceptible impression in the mud. Around him stood 20 Marines of various ranks, watching intently as the Louisiana tracker demonstrated his craft. They comprised the newly formed reconnaissance unit, unofficially known as Solomon's Hunters, and they represented a dramatic departure from conventional military thinking about jungle warfare. "This print is approximately 6 hours old," Solomon explained, pointing to subtle features invisible to untrained eyes. "The edges are softened by rain, but not completely washed away. The depth tells me it's a man carrying extra weight, probably a radio or heavy weapon." Private First Class William Cooper, a recent addition to the unit, looked skeptical. "With all due respect, Sarge, how can you possibly determine that from a muddy hole in the ground?" Solomon didn't take offense. He had come to expect such skepticism, especially from men with traditional military training. "Come here," he said, gesturing for Cooper to kneel beside him. "Look at the impression from this angle. See how the weight distribution indicates forward lean? That's characteristic of someone carrying weight on their back. And here," he pointed to a barely visible line at the edge of the print, "that's the distinctive pattern of Japanese combat boots, worn on the outer edge, indicating extensive jungle travel." Cooper's expression transformed from doubt to amazement. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "And you can track them through this rain?" "Rain is both challenge and advantage," Solomon replied. "It obscures some signs, but creates others. Water flows in predictable patterns unless disturbed. A passing boot creates disruptions in that flow that persist for hours." Captain Ellsworth approached, accompanied by Major Robert Hansen, who had been assigned as the official commanding officer of the Special Reconnaissance Unit. While Solomon provided the expertise and field leadership, military protocol required an officer of appropriate rank for official command. "How's the training coming along, Sergeant?" Hansen asked. Solomon stood, wiping mud from his hands. "Progress is mixed, sir. Some men are picking it up faster than others. Tracking is not something that can be mastered in weeks. My grandfather spent years teaching me." "We don't have years," Hansen reminded him. "The Japanese are adapting. Their patrols are becoming more cautious, harder to locate. Which is why we need to change our approach," Solomon replied. "With respect, sir, we've been focusing on teaching tracking skills. That's important, but it's only half the equation. We also need to teach counter-tracking, how to move without leaving signs the enemy can follow." Hansen considered this. Unlike many officers, he had quickly recognized the value of Solomon's unconventional methods and supported them, despite skepticism from traditional military leadership. "What do you need?" 3 days with each squad, focused exclusively on movement techniques. No weapons training, no conventional tactics, just learning to move through the jungle correctly." Ellsworth intervened. 3 days is a long time to take combat squads out of rotation, especially with the Japanese pressing as hard as they are. Solomon looked directly at both officers. 3 days of training now could save hundreds of lives later. The Japanese are learning this jungle faster than we are. If we don't adapt quickly, we'll be fighting at a permanent disadvantage. After a brief discussion, Hansen made his decision. "You have your 3 days, Sergeant. I'll clear it with command. Start with the scout teams that directly support our forward positions." As the officers departed, Solomon turned back to his trainees. "We're going to continue following this track. The goal isn't just to find where the Japanese soldier went, but to understand why he chose this particular path. In the jungle, the why is often more important than the where." The group moved deeper into the dense vegetation, with Solomon periodically pointing out signs of passage that gradually became visible to the more observant trainees. Cooper, despite his initial skepticism, proved to be among the quickest learners. "You grew up hunting?" Solomon asked him during a brief rest. Cooper nodded. "Deer, mostly, in the Ozarks. Nothing like this jungle, though." "The principles are the same, just applied differently," Solomon explained. "The key is learning to see patterns of disturbance against the natural background. Your eyes already know how to do this. They just need to be retrained for this environment." By late afternoon, Solomon had led the group in a wide arc that intentionally intersected the paths of 3 different Japanese patrols. At each intersection, he demonstrated how to determine the size of the patrol, its heading, speed, and even details about the equipment they carried, all from subtle signs most soldiers would have walked past without noticing. As they prepared to return to the American lines, distant thunder rolled across the island. Rodriguez, who had been with Solomon since the first mission, glanced skyward. "More rain coming." Solomon shook his head slightly. "That's not thunder. That's naval artillery. The Japanese are bringing in reinforcements." The Marines exchanged concerned glances. They had all heard the intelligence reports. The Imperial Japanese Navy was attempting to land thousands of fresh troops on the northern coast. If successful, these reinforcements would significantly outnumber the American forces currently holding Henderson Field. "Does that change our training schedule, Sarge?" Jenkins asked. "On the contrary," Solomon replied. "It makes it more urgent. Let's move." That evening, Solomon met with Major Hanson, Captain Ellsworth, and Colonel Matthews in the command bunker near Henderson Field. Maps of Guadalcanal covered a makeshift table with known Japanese positions marked in red. "The situation is deteriorating," Matthews stated bluntly. "We've counted at least 3,000 Japanese troops landing at Taivu Point in the past 24 hours. Intelligence suggests another 4,000 may arrive within the week." Hanson studied the map grimly. "That would give them almost 2-to-1 numerical superiority. Which is why we need better intelligence on their movements," Matthews continued. "Conventional aerial reconnaissance is limited due to weather and jungle canopy. We need your unit, Solomon, to provide detailed information on Japanese troop deployments and likely avenues of approach." Solomon examined the map carefully before responding. "The Japanese will use these ridgelines to mask their movement," he said, tracing his finger along a series of elevated features. "Based on the patrols we've tracked so far, they favor moving along higher ground when available, only descending into valleys when necessary. It's standard military doctrine, but it makes them predictable." "So you're saying we should focus our defenses along these approaches?" Ellsworth asked. "No," Solomon replied. "I'm saying those are the areas we should avoid defending directly. The Japanese expect us to contest the high ground. Instead, we should position our forces to strike at them when they're in transition between ridgelines, when they're most vulnerable." Matthews looked skeptical. "That contradicts established tactical doctrine." "Respectfully, sir, established tactical doctrine wasn't developed for jungle warfare against an enemy with superior numbers. We need to fight asymmetrically. Hit them where they're weak, avoid them where they're strong." The colonel considered this unconventional advice. Solomon had proven the value of his approach during the initial landing, but scaling those methods to a larger battlefield presented significant challenges. "What exactly are you proposing?" Matthews finally asked. "My unit can identify the most likely Japanese approach routes and establish observation posts. We'll provide early warning of major troop movements and conduct limited harassment operations to slow their advance and create confusion about our actual defensive positions." Hanson nodded approvingly. "Classic guerrilla tactics, applied with precision." "Precisely," Solomon agreed. "The Japanese are disciplined and methodical. That's their strength, but also their weakness. They expect us to behave according to conventional military doctrine. When we don't, it creates psychological pressure that compounds their physical challenges in this environment." After further discussion, Matthews reluctantly approved Solomon's plan. "You have 48 hours to establish your observation network. After that, I want daily intelligence reports on Japanese movements. And remember, your primary mission is reconnaissance, not direct engagement." Solomon acknowledged the order, though he knew that strict separation between observation and action was rarely possible in jungle warfare. His grandfather had taught him that sometimes the hunter must become directly involved to direct the prey's movement. The next morning, Solomon divided his unit into 5-man teams. Each team would establish an observation post along likely Japanese approach routes, maintaining communication through a combination of field telephones where possible and runners where necessary. Solomon himself would lead the team covering the most critical sector. The northern approach that intelligence suggested would be the Japanese main effort. Before departing, he gathered the unit for final instructions. The men stood in a loose circle, their uniforms already showing adaptations to jungle conditions. Darker colors, modified equipment arrangements to minimize noise, boots wrapped with canvas strips to reduce their visible signature on soft ground. "Remember what we've practiced," Solomon told them. "Move like water through the jungle, following the path of least resistance. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Trust your instincts. The jungle speaks to those who listen." Private Cooper raised his hand. "What about engagement protocols, Sarge? When do we fight and when do we withdraw?" It was a good question, one that reflected the fundamental tension in their mission. "Our primary objective is to observe and report," Solomon replied. But if you're discovered, use the dispersal tactics we've practiced. Strike from multiple directions, create the impression of a larger force, then disappear. Never engage in a fixed position for more than 30 seconds. This was heresy by traditional military standards, which emphasized holding ground and concentrated firepower. But Solomon's men had seen the effectiveness of his methods firsthand. They nodded in understanding. "One last thing," Solomon added. "The Japanese are adapting. Some of their patrols have begun using techniques similar to ours, moving more carefully, concealing their trails. Respect their capabilities, but remember, they're still thinking like soldiers. We need to think like hunters." As the teams moved out toward their assigned sectors, Captain Ellsworth approached Solomon privately. "The men have a lot of confidence in you," he observed, "even the ones who were skeptical at first." Solomon checked his equipment one final time before responding. "They're good Marines. They recognize what works regardless of who's teaching it." "It's more than that," Ellsworth insisted. "They respect you, not just your skills, but your leadership." He hesitated, then added, "That's significant considering the circumstances." They both understood what remained unsaid. As a black sergeant leading predominantly white Marines in 1942, Solomon's position was unprecedented and precarious. The military remained largely segregated, with most black servicemen restricted to support roles. Solomon's unit represented a rare exception, born of necessity and proven effectiveness rather than institutional change. "The jungle doesn't care about the color of my skin," Solomon said simply. "Neither do the Japanese. All that matters out there is who can move more silently, who can see the signs others miss, who can think further ahead." Ellsworth nodded. "For what it's worth, I believe your approach will change how we fight this war, not just here on Guadalcanal, but across the Pacific." "One patrol at a time, Captain," Solomon replied pragmatically. "Right now, I'm focused on the next 48 hours." Solomon's team departed the American perimeter at first light, moving north along a carefully selected route that balanced concealment with efficient movement. With him were Rodriguez and O'Malley from his original team, along with Cooper and Corporal Marcus Wilson, a former forest ranger from Washington State who had demonstrated exceptional aptitude for jungle navigation. They traveled in a loose formation, never bunched together, maintaining visual contact without creating an obvious pattern. Solomon had trained them to move during natural sound peaks in the jungle, when bird calls or insect activity temporarily rose, masking the subtle sounds of human movement. Between these acoustic windows, they remained perfectly still, using these pauses to scan their surroundings and listen for any sign of enemy presence. By midday, they had covered nearly 4 miles, crossing 2 stream beds and a densely vegetated ridge without encountering Japanese patrols. Solomon called a brief halt in a small depression that offered good concealment and multiple exit routes, a temporary harbor as his grandfather would have called it. "We're approaching the likely Japanese movement corridor," Solomon informed his team quietly. "From here on, we communicate with hand signals only. Remember the signs we discussed." The men nodded, checking their weapons and equipment without being told. They had internalized Solomon's emphasis on readiness without unnecessary movement. Every action served a purpose. Anything that didn't was eliminated from their routine. After 15 minutes, they resumed their advance, now moving with even greater caution. Solomon led them on a path paralleling a narrow ridge that provided a natural avenue through the otherwise difficult terrain. If the Japanese were moving significant forces toward the American positions, this would be a logical route. 2 hours later, Solomon's assessment was proven correct. From a concealed position on a vegetated slope, they observed a Japanese company, approximately 120 men, moving in column along the ridge. The soldiers moved with discipline and purpose, maintaining good spacing and security elements on their flanks. This was not a reconnaissance patrol, but a combat unit preparing for offensive operations. Solomon signaled for Rodriguez to record detailed notes, unit size, weapons composition, direction of travel, and notable command elements. This information would be invaluable for American defensive preparations. As they watched, Solomon noted something concerning. The Japanese point elements were moving with unusual caution, frequently stopping to examine the ground and surrounding vegetation. One soldier in particular appeared to be actively looking for signs of American movement, not just watching for ambushes, but studying the jungle floor the way Solomon himself would. "They're learning," Solomon whispered to O'Malley, indicating the Japanese point man. "That one has tracking skills." After the Japanese company had passed, Solomon led his team in a wide loop around the ridge, positioning them to observe another potential approach route without crossing the Japanese line of march. By late afternoon, they had established their primary observation post in a dense cluster of banyan trees that offered excellent visibility of 3 converging trails while providing multiple elevated escape routes if discovered. "Rodriguez, establish the field telephone connection," Solomon ordered. "Cooper, Wilson, construct elevated sleeping positions. O'Malley, you're on first watch. I'm going to scout our immediate perimeter." As the men set about their tasks, Solomon moved methodically in a 360-degree circle around their position, extending outward about 100 yards in each direction. He was establishing what his grandfather had called a sensory boundary, learning the normal patterns of the immediate environment so that any disruption would be immediately noticeable. He returned just as dusk was settling over the jungle. Rodriguez had successfully connected their field telephone to a wire team that had worked its way forward from the American lines. They now had direct communication with headquarters, a significant advantage for rapid intelligence transmission. 2 more Japanese units observed moving south, Solomon reported to Major Hansen over the field telephone. Estimated strength 1 company each, well-equipped, including light machine guns and what appeared to be portable mortar components. Hansen's voice crackled through the primitive handset. Any indication of their timeline for attack? "Based on their movement rate and equipment load, they're still at least 24 hours from being in position to launch a coordinated assault. They're being deliberate, establishing support positions before committing their main force." "That matches reports from our other observation posts," Hansen confirmed. "Continue monitoring and report any changes immediately." As night fell, Solomon's team settled into their rotation schedule, 1 man always on watch while the others rested in elevated positions secured to the massive banyan trees. These sleeping perches, inspired by techniques Solomon's grandfather had used for hunting dangerous predators in the Louisiana swamps, kept them safely above ground level, where most patrols would focus their attention. Shortly after midnight, Cooper, who had taken the watch position, alerted Solomon with a subtle bird call they used as a signal. Solomon was instantly awake, moving silently to Cooper's position. "Movement southeast, approximately 70 yards, Cooper whispered, pointing toward a barely perceptible disturbance in the understory vegetation. Solomon watched carefully, his experienced eyes quickly distinguishing the systematic movement pattern of human activity from the random motions of nocturnal animals. "Japanese patrol," he confirmed. "Small unit, probably security screen for their main force." The patrol consisted of only 8 men, but moved with exceptional discipline and caution. More concerning was their pattern. They were conducting a methodical sweep rather than following a fixed route. This suggested they suspected American observation teams might be operating in the area. "Wake the others," Solomon instructed quietly. "We may need to relocate." Within moments, the entire team was alert, weapons ready, but maintaining absolute silence. Solomon signaled for them to remain in position while he assessed the patrol's movement pattern. The Japanese search pattern would bring them within 30 yards of the American position, close enough to potentially detect signs of their presence, but not directly into their hiding place. Solomon had 2 options: maintain absolute stillness and hope the patrol passed without discovering them, or implement a controlled diversion to direct the Japanese away from their location. He chose the latter, recognizing that even the best concealment could fail against a determined search. Using hand signals, he directed O'Malley to create a distraction approximately 100 yards to the west, away from both their current position and the Japanese main force locations they had observed earlier. O'Malley moved like a shadow through the undergrowth, circling wide around the approaching Japanese patrol. Solomon and the remaining team members prepared to relocate if necessary, gathering only their most essential equipment. 5 minutes later, A series of subtle sounds came from the western quadrant, nothing as obvious as breaking branches, but rather the distinctive rustling pattern of something large moving through dense vegetation, followed by the alarm call of a disturbed jungle bird. The combination was precisely what Solomon had taught O'Malley to create, signals that would appear natural to untrained observers, but would draw the attention of experienced jungle fighters. The Japanese patrol reacted as anticipated, altering their search pattern toward the disturbance. Their disciplined response confirmed Solomon's assessment. These were veteran troops with significant jungle experience, not raw replacements. Once the patrol had moved sufficiently far from their observation post, Solomon signaled for the team to implement a contingency measure they had prepared. Using lengths of cord, they carefully transferred their essential equipment up into the higher branches of the banyan trees, then followed themselves, ascending to positions nearly 40 feet above the forest floor. From this elevation, they would be effectively invisible to ground-based searches, unless the Japanese specifically thought to look upward, an unlikely contingency given traditional military training's focus on ground-level threats. O'Malley rejoined them an hour later, climbing a prearranged access route on the opposite side of the tree cluster. They searched the area thoroughly, he reported quietly, then continued westward. I don't think they're coming back to this sector tonight. Good work, Solomon acknowledged, but this changes things. The Japanese are implementing systematic counter-reconnaissance measures. They're not just moving toward Henderson Field, they're actively working to blind us first. This development required immediate communication to headquarters. Solomon used the field telephone to report the enhanced Japanese security measures to Major Hansen. This confirms reports from 2 other observation posts, Hansen responded. The Japanese are adapting to our techniques faster than anticipated. Colonel Matthews is considering withdrawing all observation teams to prevent losses. Solomon frowned. With respect, sir, that would be a mistake. Yes, the Japanese are improving their counter-reconnaissance, but they haven't mastered it. If we pull back now, we'll lose visibility on their preparations entirely. What do you suggest instead? Let me adjust our operational pattern. We'll become more mobile, change observation positions more frequently, and implement more sophisticated counter-tracking measures. My team can train the other observation units on these techniques. After a brief consultation with Colonel Matthews, Hansen granted Solomon the authority to modify their reconnaissance approach. Over the next 48 hours, Solomon's team demonstrated remarkable adaptability, relocating their observation position 6 times while maintaining continuous monitoring of Japanese force movements. They successfully identified the assembly areas for what appeared to be a regiment-sized Japanese force preparing for a major assault on the American perimeter. On August 7th, 5 days into their mission, Solomon's team observed a significant change in Japanese activity. The methodical preparation suddenly shifted to more urgent movement. Command elements could be seen moving between units, and the previously disciplined communications security deteriorated as more messengers ran between positions. Something's changed, Solomon observed. They're accelerating their timeline. Rodriguez, who had been monitoring Japanese radio traffic patterns through observing their communications teams, agreed. Message volume has doubled in the past hour. Whatever they're planning, it's happening soon. Solomon made an immediate decision. Cooper, Wilson, maintain this observation post. Continue reporting on any movement. Rodriguez, O'Malley, you're with me. We need to get closer to their command element to determine what's happening. This exceeded their strict reconnaissance mandate, but Solomon recognized the critical importance of understanding the sudden change in Japanese preparations. If an attack was imminent, every minute of warning could save American lives. The 3 men moved with extraordinary caution toward the area where they had observed Japanese officers gathering. They used every technique in Solomon's extensive repertoire, moving only when natural sounds provided cover, freezing in position when exposed, using vegetation patterns to break up their outlines. It was less like soldiers moving and more like predators stalking, patient, deliberate, and virtually invisible to conventional observation. By late afternoon, they had worked their way to within 80 yards of what was clearly a Japanese command post. Officers gathered around field tables covered with maps, radio operators transmitted continuous messages, and runners departed in various directions, carrying written orders. From their concealed position in dense undergrowth, Solomon and his men observed the operation without being detected. Rodriguez, who had some understanding of Japanese, attempted to interpret fragments of conversation that carried to their position. Something about reinforcements, naval support, and a timetable being moved forward. Solomon integrated these fragments with his observations of the officers' behavior and map gestures. "They're launching their attack tonight," he concluded. "Full regiment, multiple axes of advance. It looks like they received word of some advantage. Perhaps naval support, as Rodriguez mentioned." This intelligence was too critical to rely on their distant field telephone connection. Solomon made another decision that contradicted conventional doctrine, but served the greater mission. "O'Malley, return to our observation post. Tell Cooper and Wilson to maintain position and continue reporting. Then proceed immediately to American lines with this information. Japanese regiment-sized attack, multiple axes, commencing approximately 0100 hours. I believe they're attempting to coordinate with naval bombardment." O'Malley nodded, memorizing the message. "What about you and Rodriguez? We're staying to gather more specific intelligence on their main effort direction and unit compositions. We'll follow within 2 hours." As O'Malley departed, Solomon and Rodriguez continued their observation of the Japanese command post. As darkness fell, they witnessed the final preparation orders being distributed. Through careful observation of unit insignia and equipment allocations, they identified the Japanese main effort, a 2-company force that would attack directly along the ridge they had been monitoring for days. "That's valuable intelligence," Rodriguez whispered. "Command can concentrate our reserves against their primary thrust." Solomon agreed. "Let's withdraw now. We've learned what we needed to." As they began their careful movement back toward American lines, a sudden change in the ambient jungle sounds alerted Solomon. He froze in position, signaling Rodriguez to do likewise. Seconds later, a Japanese patrol materialized from the darkness less than 20 yards away, moving directly toward their position. This patrol moved differently from the others they had encountered. The point man studied the ground and vegetation with expert precision, clearly employing tracking techniques similar to Solomon's own methods. Behind him, the patrol maintained perfect noise discipline, their movements synchronized with natural jungle sounds, just as Solomon had taught his own men. "They have their own tracker," Solomon breathed, barely audible even to Rodriguez beside him. "And he's good." For perhaps the first time since arriving on Guadalcanal, Solomon faced an opponent with skills comparable to his own. The Japanese tracker paused, kneeling to examine something on the jungle floor. With a sinking feeling, Solomon realized the man had detected some sign of their passage, perhaps a compressed leaf, a disturbed insect pattern, or one of the dozens of subtle indicators that Solomon himself would have noticed. The Japanese tracker looked up, scanning the surrounding vegetation with newfound intensity. His gaze passed over their position once, then returned, narrowing as he focused on the subtle disturbance in the foliage pattern where Solomon and Rodriguez lay motionless. In that moment, Solomon made a rapid calculation. If they remained still, the tracker would certainly confirm their position, and the patrol would encircle them. If they moved, they would create additional signs that would accelerate their discovery. A third option existed, but it carried tremendous risk. Solomon made his decision instantly. Using hand signals, he communicated his plan to Rodriguez, who nodded in understanding despite the danger involved. The Japanese tracker began moving deliberately toward their position, signaling his patrol to spread out for potential engagement. He had not yet confirmed the presence of Americans, but clearly suspected it. Before the Japanese could complete their encirclement, Solomon implemented his desperate gambit. Rather than retreating or hiding, he and Rodriguez suddenly moved directly toward the approaching patrol, slipping between 2 flanking soldiers in the brief moment when their attention was directed elsewhere. It was the last thing the Japanese expected, enemies moving toward them rather than away. The maneuver succeeded through its sheer audacity. Solomon and Rodriguez passed within feet of the Japanese soldiers, then accelerated into the darkness beyond, using the patrol's own position to mask their movement from the tracker's skilled eyes. By the time the Japanese realized what had happened, Solomon and Rodriguez had disappeared into the jungle, moving rapidly along a route parallel to the American lines. Behind them, they could hear the Japanese patrol spreading out in search patterns, but the confusion over which direction the Americans had gone provided the critical minutes needed to break contact. An hour later, breathing hard from their sustained movement through difficult terrain, Solomon and Rodriguez reached the American perimeter. They were immediately escorted to the command bunker, where Colonel Matthews, Major Hanson, and Captain Ellsworth waited anxiously. "O'Malley delivered your warning," Hanson informed them. "We've already repositioned our defenses to meet the expected attack." Solomon quickly provided the additional intelligence they had gathered, the specific Japanese units involved, their assembly areas, and most importantly the main effort identification that would allow the Americans to concentrate their limited reserves appropriately. "There's something else, sir," Solomon added. "The Japanese have developed their own jungle tracking specialists. I encountered one. He nearly detected us using techniques very similar to what I've been teaching our men." Matthews frowned. "How is that possible? Have they been observing your methods somehow?" "More likely convergent development," Solomon explained. "They're facing the same jungle challenges we are. Some of their veterans have probably developed similar solutions independently. The Japanese are adaptable and observant. We should expect them to improve their jungle craft over time." This sobering assessment was interrupted by the distant rumble of naval artillery. The Japanese attack had begun. American defensive positions around Henderson Field erupted in gunfire as Japanese infantry emerged from the jungle along multiple avenues of approach. Thanks to the early warning and specific intelligence provided by Solomon's reconnaissance team, the American defenders were prepared. Artillery concentrations targeted the identified Japanese assembly areas, while reserve units moved to reinforce the sectors facing the main Japanese effort. The battle raged throughout the night. Solomon and his team, despite their exhaustion, provided ongoing advice to the command staff, interpreting Japanese movement patterns and suggesting countermeasures based on their observations of enemy tactics. By dawn, the Japanese attack had been repulsed with heavy losses. The expected naval support had materialized, but proved less effective than the Japanese commanders had hoped against the well-prepared American positions. As the jungle battlefield gradually quieted, with only sporadic firefights continuing on the perimeter, Colonel Matthews called Solomon to his command post. "Your reconnaissance teams provided the critical intelligence that made this defense successful," Matthews acknowledged. "I've sent a full report to divisional headquarters recommending the expansion of your training program to all Marine units operating in the Pacific Theater." Solomon accepted the acknowledgement with characteristic modesty. "The men performed exceptionally, sir. They applied the techniques effectively and showed tremendous initiative." "This goes beyond techniques, Sergeant," Matthews continued. "You've demonstrated a fundamentally different approach to jungle warfare, one that emphasizes understanding and adapting to the environment rather than imposing conventional tactical doctrines upon it. That's a lesson the entire Marine Corps needs to learn." In the weeks that followed, Solomon's role expanded dramatically. His training program was formalized, with instructors selected from his original team to teach other Marine units. The Solomon method, as it became known informally, evolved from a specialized reconnaissance technique into a comprehensive approach to jungle warfare that influenced Marine Corps operations throughout the Pacific Campaign. By October 1942, as the battle for Guadalcanal reached its decisive phase, dozens of specialized reconnaissance teams operated throughout the island, employing Solomon's methods to provide unprecedented intelligence on Japanese movements and counter Japanese attempts to do the same. More significantly, conventional Marine infantry units began incorporating elements of Solomon's approach into their standard operations, moving more effectively through jungle terrain, reading the environment for signs of enemy activity, and employing natural features to tactical advantage. The Japanese still maintained certain advantages in discipline and equipment, but their previously superior jungle craft had been neutralized and ultimately surpassed. For Sergeant James Solomon personally, the experience proved transformative in ways that extended beyond military tactics. His unique knowledge, once valued primarily for hunting in the Louisiana bayous, had changed the course of a critical campaign in a global conflict. The skills passed down from his Choctaw grandfather, developed over generations of living harmoniously with challenging environments, had proven more effective in some ways than formal military doctrine developed over centuries of conventional warfare. In late October, as American forces secured their hold on Henderson Field and began offensive operations to clear remaining Japanese forces from Guadalcanal, Solomon received orders transferring him to a special training command being established in New Caledonia. There he would develop a comprehensive program to train Marine reconnaissance specialists in his methods, creating a multiplier effect that would influence operations across the Pacific Theater. The night before his departure, Solomon's original team gathered for a private farewell. O'Malley, Rodriguez, Jenkins, and Cooper had all received promotions and would remain on Guadalcanal to lead their own specialized units. "You've changed how this war will be fought in the Pacific," O'Malley told him, the Irish Marine's usual humor replaced by genuine respect. Not bad for a bayou hunter from Louisiana. Solomon smiled slightly. "My grandfather always said that nature teaches the most important lessons to those willing to listen. The jungle is just another teacher, with different lessons than the swamps back home." "Will the Corps keep this going after the war?" Rodriguez wondered. "Or will they go back to conventional tactics once the emergency passes?" "That depends on men like you," Solomon replied. "The knowledge has to be passed on, adapted, improved, just like my grandfather passed it to me." The next morning, as Solomon boarded the transport plane that would carry him to New Caledonia, Captain Ellsworth approached for a final conversation. "You know, when I first requested your transfer to our unit, I had no idea where it would lead," Ellsworth admitted. "I just saw your file, noted your hunting background, and thought you might have some useful skills for jungle operations." Solomon nodded. "Sometimes the most valuable knowledge comes from unexpected sources." "There's something else," Ellsworth added, lowering his voice slightly. "Division headquarters is processing a recommendation for you to receive a battlefield commission as an officer. The paperwork will catch up to you in New Caledonia." Solomon absorbed this news with characteristic composure, though its significance wasn't lost on him. In 1942, black officers remained exceedingly rare in the segregated military. His achievement represented not just personal recognition, but a small crack in a much larger systemic barrier. "The men who served with you, they've submitted statements supporting the recommendation," Ellsworth continued. "They don't care about anything except the fact that your knowledge and leadership saved lives. That's the only measuring stick that matters in combat." As the transport plane lifted off from the Henderson Field airstrip, Solomon looked down at the island that had transformed from an obscure South Pacific location into a pivotal battleground. The dense jungle canopy stretched below, concealing both Japanese and American patrols still engaged in the deadly game of hunter and hunted that he had helped redefine. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from a young boy learning traditional tracking skills in the Louisiana bayous to a Marine sergeant whose methods were reshaping Pacific warfare. His grandfather would never have imagined how his teachings would be applied, yet the core wisdom remained the same. Respect the environment, read its signs, move in harmony with it rather than against it. The Japanese forces on Guadalcanal had entered the jungle, believing their superior military discipline and training would prevail. They hadn't expected to encounter an American whose traditional hunting knowledge would neutralize that advantage, a man whose lifelong connection to the natural world would transform jungle combat in ways that conventional military thinking could never have anticipated. As Guadalcanal receded behind him, Solomon knew that his grandfather's knowledge would continue spreading throughout the Pacific Theater, passed from marine to marine, just as it had once been passed from elder to youth in his Louisiana community. Ancient wisdom applied to modern warfare, traditional knowledge proving its enduring value in humanity's most technologically advanced conflict. In the months and years that followed, as the Allied advance pushed ever closer to Japan itself, specialized reconnaissance units trained in Solomon's methods operated throughout the Pacific Islands. Their effectiveness validated Solomon's fundamental insight that sometimes the most powerful knowledge isn't developed in military academies or written in tactical manuals, but passed down through generations of those who learned to live in harmony with challenging environments. Lieutenant James Solomon, as he eventually became, would train hundreds of Marines in his techniques before the war's end. Many of these men would go on to influence post-war military doctrine, permanently altering how American forces prepared for and conducted operations in jungle environments worldwide. The specialized reconnaissance units that evolved from Solomon's original team would eventually influence the formation of more formalized special operations capabilities in the decades following World War II. Perhaps most significantly, Solomon's success challenged prevailing attitudes about which kinds of knowledge held value in modern warfare. Traditional skills once dismissed as primitive or obsolete had proven decisive in one of the war's most important campaigns. The hunter's way of reading the land, passed down through indigenous traditions and rural practices, had outperformed conventional military approaches when applied to the unique challenges of jungle combat. For Solomon himself, the experience reinforced what his grandfather had always taught him, that wisdom often comes from unexpected sources, that understanding the natural world provides advantages that technology alone cannot match, and that respect for traditional knowledge opens doors that might otherwise remain closed. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.